وحياته إني على دين
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah. So what is al-ta'ayyun al-thani? Al-ta'ayyun al-thani is, well, what's ta'ayyun al-awwal and what's not ta'ayyun? So this is something which is very important, and it's worth having in the background while we study, because this is the approach that we hope to be a insignificant student of when we're working on this question of nafs al-amr and the other things that we're looking at Taba. And this is the foundational methodology that this is the ontology also, which is lying in the background. And so just a very brief view of this, if you put down three terms, al-ahadiyah, al-wahda, and al-wahidiyah. Now these correspond broadly to martabat al-la ta'ayyun, the degree of non-determination, and then al-wahda to al-ta'ayyun al-awwal, and al-wahidiyya to al-ta'ayyun al-thani. And then in yet another way of looking at it, you could say al-wujud al-mutlaq, totally unrestricted being, and then you have al-fayd al-aqdas, which is which is rather similar actually to this concept here, but al-fayd al-aqdas, which is the way in which the a'yan al-thabita become determinate. It's the fayd of the haqq, yes, the most holy effusion, exactly, Sidi, which is the fayd, the non-temporal fayd outside of time, by which the a'yan al-thabita become determinate. And then the fayd al-muqaddas al-sifati, so there's al-fayd al-aqdas al-dhati, and there's al-fayd al-muqaddas al-sifati, which is the way that the extramental particulars, not necessarily the particulars, but the various maratib of khalq take place, is through that second fayd. And so if we go back to the ahadiyah is considering the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of He subhanahu wa ta'ala being beyond any possible predicate or any possible description or any possible attribute that we can relate to anything in the degrees of experience. Assalamu alaikum, Yahya. That's Mehmet Erkin's son. He's my dear friend Mehmet from Turkey. Habibi, how are you? So al-ahadiyya is considering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as beyond any of the attributes that we can ascribe to him. Now, this doesn't mean that he doesn't have the names and attributes in himself, but it's a recognition that when we think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in himself, but we won't then be able to affirm anything positive about him, which finally Kareem's arrived. I felt very nervous until he arrived. Now I can relax. But before we can affirm any anything about what he is really like in himself, we have to be thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of madahir. If we're talking about him in himself, in his itlaq, then that's impossible on this understanding. So how then is the transition from that pure unknowability to the beginning of determinateness and creation? How does that take place on this understanding very broadly? I hope this will be of help to us when we try to read the texts and when we look at secondary literature and things, because it's good to have a clear understanding of the framework. There are many, many details, and there are many differences and many different terminological usages. But in any case, the first determination, the bridge that goes from the pure Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his pure itlaq, which is beyond knowledge, it's beyond knowing. Knowledge can't even pertain to it because of the definition of knowledge and the nature of knowledge, is al-ta'ayyun al-awwal. And this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals his nature to himself. And please, let's have a proviso about this language. He eternally knows everything about himself. This is not talking about a temporal process. It's not talking about parts of the essence. What it's talking about is maratib aqliya i'tibariya, the way that we look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legitimately in terms of the haqa'iq. But it doesn't mean that there's a process going on or there are parts, as you know, hasha lillah, to where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala requires revealing himself in this way or that, or that there are different sections to the divine essence or anything like that. What it means is that when we look at the divine nature and the unfolding of creation, we discern that there are, well, we should say Sadatunal discerned, and we have some degree of book understanding of what they've said, and also there's a degree to which there is an aqli dimension to this as well. But so that's just a very important proviso. It's very important to look at this as perspectival, something which is rooted in reality but is perspectival. When we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his essence, of course, there's the famous hadith which says, think on the attributes, but do not think on the essence, or kama qal. And so that's rather important. In a way, the Akbaris have the best solution to that, because when they talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his itlaq, they say he's absolutely unknowable in his essence, as he really is in himself. Only he knows himself as he truly is in fullness, in his fullness. We only know him through the way that he reveals himself to us. In any case, the al-ta'ayyun al-awwal, the first determination, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala manifesting his nature in the most perfect madhar, jami', which encompasses the realities of his essence, but in something which is determinate. When we think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in himself, his nature is infinite, it's beyond anything we can grasp. And even were we to be raised up to the highest levels, we still wouldn't be able to grasp it. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can grasp it. But in the background to the process of creation depended upon the haqa'iq of the essence becoming distinct. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said kun to the a'yan in his knowledge, and they had to be distinct. And the wahda is the bridge between the pure unknowability of the essence and the martabat al-wahidiyah, when all of the haqa'iq, which are the suwar of the asma, i.e. the a'yan thabita, become manifest distinctly. That's a martabat al-wahidiyah. And the bridge by which this takes place is al-wahda, which is a determination of existence, the supreme determination of existence, which contained within it, as in embryonic form, as a seed, all of the haqa'iq, which then, but which aren't distinct in that particular martaba, but which in the next martaba, which is the level of the a'yan thabita, or the fixed essences, they become fully distinct. And that's also the martaba in which the divine names become distinct. It's not that they didn't exist in the essence, but they become distinct. And so this is also al-ta'ayyun al-thani. So al-ta'ayyun al-thani is the ta'ayyun in which the essences become distinct in their full multiplicity. Yeah, so it says here, ta'ayyun al-thani huwa thani rutba al-dhat, wa hiya الرتبة التي تظهر فيها الأشياء وتتميز ظهورا وتميزا علميا، ولهذا تسمى هذه الحضرة بحضرة المعاني وبعالم المعاني وبالحضرة العلمية. So the second determination is the second degree of the essence, and this is the degree within which all things become manifest and become distinctly manifest. They become manifest, they become distinct. Yeah, in a manifestation and a becoming distinct, which is sciential, is almiya. And this is why, this is why this hadra is called Hadrat al-Ma'ani, the presence of the meanings, literally, terrible translation. وَبِعَالِمِ الْمَعَانِي, the world of meanings, وَبِالْحَضْرَ الْعَلْمِيَّةِ, and the sciential presence, al-Hadra al-Almiya. Now this hadra simultaneously is the highest level of knowledge that the mukashaf can reach. They can reach the level of knowledge of the a'yan thabita and the supreme ayn thabit, of which is al-haqiqa al-muhammadiyya, which is also identified with al-ta'ayyun al-awwal. And so the ta'ayyun al-thani branches out from al-ta'ayyun al-awwal, and the haqiqa muhammadiyya, atemporally, all of the essences in the hadra al-almiya branch out from haqiqa al-muhammadiyya. He has the priority and the primacy. So وكانت المحبة الأصلية, and what's al-mahabba al-asliya? Al-mahabba al-asliya is the referring to the hadith Qudsi, kuntu kanzan makhfiyan. It's not considered a hadith in terms of, but it's very maqbool and al-mukashafin. So So al-mahabba al-asliya refers to that mahabba, which is the love that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, the irada that he has to reveal himself. Al-mahabba al-asliya allati hiya qabiliyyat al-dhuhur, which is the capacity to become manifest. Kama arafta wa satarif, he says in this wonderful book. So the mahabba al-asliya أنه إنما تنبعث من الباطن إلى الظاهر بهذا التعين الثاني. Yeah, so why is it appropriate to call it a nafas al-Rahmani? Because the ta'ayyun al-thani is the way in which that distinct creation which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala desires to know him becomes manifest distinctly. It's through that failed إذا التعين الذي قبله, because the ta'ayyun which is before it, the first determination, هو التعين الأول نسبة البطون والظهور إليه على السواء. It's not, it has an equal relationship to al-butun, which is the hiddenness of the essence, and the dhuhur, which is the appearing of the essence. In any case, so now there also, just as a terminological quibble, which you should also watch out for in Akbarianism, there is another identification of it which is made, which is that it's identified with al-ama, and this seems to be with al-ahadiyah, sorry. So this seems to be something which appears later on in the tradition. So if you look in the Kashaf of Tahanawi, for example, he says, فَالْفَرْقُ بَيْنَ الْعَمَى وَالْأَحَدِيَّةِ. He first identifies it with al-ahadiyah. He says, but there's a slight perspectival difference. الفرق بين العمى والأحادية أن الأحادية حكم الذات في الذات بمقتضى التعالي وهو الظهور الذاتي الأحدي، والعمى حكم الذات بمقتضى الإطلاق فلا يفهم منه تعال ولا تدان وهو البطون الذاتي العمائي، فهي مقابلة الأحدية، فهي مقابلة للأحدية. And he says later on, وفي التحفة المرسلة by Burhan Puri is a very, very important later text on the Haqiqa Muhammadiyya and the Akbarian Madhab. Absolutely fantastic book, very widely loved by the Mashayikh. وفي التحفة المرسلة, it's available as a PDF. It's very short and very brilliant and wonderful book. وفي التحفة المرسلة للوجود الحق سبحانه مراتب. الأولى مرتبة اللا تعين والإطلاق والذات البحت، لا بمعنى أن قيد الإطلاق ومفهوم سلب التعين ثابتان في تلك المرتبة، بل بمعنى أن ذلك الوجود في تلك المرتبة منزه عن إضافة جميع الحدود إليه حتى عن قيد الإطلاق أيضا، ويسمى بالمرتبة الأحدية. And we have also in Qaysari, interestingly, because he's the student of Qashani, he says in the مقدمة حقيقة الوجود إذا أخذت بشرط أن لا يكون معها شيء فهي المسمى عند القوم بالمرتبة الأحدية المستهلكة جميع الأسماء وصفاته فيها وتسمى جمع الجمع وحقيقة الحقائق والعمى أيضا. Interestingly. Maulana, would you be able to read? We're all absolutely freezing here. There's no heating. It's quite wonderful. Yeah.
نفس الأمر in logic, epistemology, and metaphysics. Each of the foregoing examples, regardless of the particular difficulties they present for the task of identifying the nature of nafs al-amr, share in a recognition of some sense of supra-subjective truth. This sense was, in the various schools of the Arabic and Islamic philosophical tradition, explored and validated through three main sets of specific questions pertaining to nafs al-amr, or the thing as it is in itself.
By the way, in itself is a mistake here. We need to take it out. CD Cream will know all about that. But talking about the thing as it is in itself, that's a leftover from an earlier stage of the paper, and it managed to creep in. But after discussions, we realized that thing in itself is not really an appropriate translation of nafs al-amr.
Which we might conveniently characterize as logical, epistemological, and metaphysical. In the logical sphere, this was chiefly the question of predicative scope. Has nafs al-amr a wider predicative scope than the individuated world of experimental particulars, al-kharij, or the mind, al-dhihn? Can the same proposition be true with regard to all of these loci, al-kharij, al-dhihn? Or are the first two mutually exclusive? In cases in which they correspond to nafs al-amr, these questions will be treated in our discussion below of Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani's famous treatises on nafs al-amr. On a more properly metaphysical level of discourse, numerous questions arise. Can all types of existent quiddities and essences be said to be confined to experimental particulars and the mind? Or is it impossible for certain of them to be limited to these categories, such that the involvement of a third location becomes necessary, namely nafs al-amr thus conceived? This is a question we will examine during our consideration of Sa'd-ad-Din al-Taftazani's and al-Jurjani's respective discussions of real and relational composite quiddities. Al-Mahiyat al-Murakkaba al-Haqiqiyya wal-Idafiyya.
Can we stop there for now? Thank you. So you can stay if you don't mind, Siddy, because you say you don't have to keep on coming back and forth. So essentially the tartib of this book is to look at nafs al-amr in logic, epistemology, and metaphysics in a very broad sense. So that is something that we'll discuss in the next section after this introduction. And this is the question after the historical question, the historical section. And this is the question that of the relationship between the logical relationship between al-kharij, al-dhihn, and nafs al-amr. So while we know that anything which is true fil kharij is also true for dhihn necessarily, and is also true fi nafs al-amr necessarily, it also happens to be the case, which is very crucial for our whole mode of investigation, that you can have something which is true for dhihn, which is not true fil kharij. Anything which is true for dhihn will have to be true for nafs al-amr, because actually everything which is true for nafs al-amr. But there are some things which are true for dhihn and are not true for al-kharij. So, and that of course is the fundamental problem we're dealing with. You know, in a kind of positivist framework, a verificationist framework, there's no problem of nafs al-amr in the first place, because everything that you can say just has an empirical referent that you can point to, and that's all there is to it. And then they say, well, metaphysics is literally nonsense. It doesn't refer to anything. It doesn't, and unfortunately, they include all of theology in that. And that's a very outmoded way of thinking, which was formally discredited in academic philosophy. But the interesting thing is that it's still dominant in a funny way. That's largely because of people like Quine, who became very influential, who, though they repudiated the Vienna Circle, they kind of found frankly, a more khabith way to still perpetuate it without making themselves look like they still subscribe to something silly. So that's a question that we'll deal with, which is fundamentally a logical question, at least in terms of its important expression. And then on a more properly metaphysical level of discourse, this is later on, numerous questions arise. Can all types of existent quiddities and essences be said to be confined to extramental particulars in the mind? Can there be an essence which is not just a hypothesis, so, maybe there's a phoenix? No, not at all. Can there be essences which, if we look carefully at the world, we look carefully at what must be in place for there to be a world, for there to be minds interacting with each other, for there to be knowledge of the world, which is real knowledge, must there be something in place, something that really exists, which is beyond both particular individual things and anything that we can say becomes manifest immanently in a human mind? There must be something about reality which is beyond the particular, which is distinct and existent, but not particular, and in the sense of individuated under a species, and that is not is not a mental phenomenon either. May become manifest in the mind, but its primary reality and ultimate reality is not mental, as in an individual mind. Or is it impossible for certain of them to be limited to these categories, such that the invocation of a third location becomes necessary, namely nafs al-amr thus conceived? This is a question we will examine during our consideration of Sa'aduddin al-Taftazani and al-Jurjani's respective discussions of real and relational composite quiddities, al-mahiyat, al-murakkaba, al-haqiqiyya, wal-idafiyya. Even when the thing you're talking about is a khariji thing, like I am sitting on this chair, even that has huge difficulties when you try to account for the truth of that statement using elements, reference, which are strictly khariji. And that's because of things like relations and so on, which necessarily enter into the full intelligibility even of khariji entities, but which are actually themselves can't be construed as khariji entities, individuated entities in any way. They're actually a kind of intelligible framework that we fit into in the world. So that's that section. Then, yeah, can we go on to the metaphysical topic?
The metaphysical topic.
Try and shout, Habibi, I'm so sorry. Try and shout.
The metaphysical topic most central to the study, however, is the serious challenge posed by intelligible abstract entities and truths, and indeed the very concept of truth, to the notion that, broadly put, the truth of a proposition is merely its correspondence to sensible and mental phenomena. The tension becomes particularly acute when we consider the possible subjectivist implication of positing that the mind is the original locus of these intelligible objects and truths. We will meet with formulations of and solutions to this and related problems by Fakhruddin al-Razi, Ibn Baha'uddin, and Tashko Pruzada, Ismail Galambawi, and others. On the ontological level, we are faced with the problem of the positive identification of nafs al-amr. Is it an actual level or degree of being, a world in and of itself? In answering this question, Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi and especially Dawood al-Qaisari have put forward influential theories. One of the most comprehensive of all answers to the question was that offered by the Ottoman sage Tashko Pruzada, who synthesized aspects of Avicennan and Akbarian thought to provide a theory that accounts for numerous related philosophical issues, such as the question of how the concept of nafs al-amr relates to the notion of exemplary forms, as well as to abstraction theory.
Can we just stop there, Roland? Thank you so much. So, but the metaphysical topic most central to this study is the serious challenge posed by intelligible so-called abstract entities. We read earlier that abstract, or it's in an earlier note if you want to have a look, where the abstract is not really the right term, but it's kind of, it will do. Abstract entities and truths, indeed the very concept of truth, to the notion that broadly put, the truth of a proposition is merely its correspondence to sensible and mental phenomena. Truth as correspondence, the correspondence theory, as opposed to a broad theory in philosophy, as opposed to the coherence theory, or other theories, the no truth theory, the deflationary theory, but the correspondence theory is broadly, it is, I mean, it's not really anachronistic to say it is, this broad theory is a correspondence theory. On higher levels, you'd say, no, it's an identity theory. What is a correspondence theory? A correspondence theory is the idea that what you're trying to account for are how propositions can be true. So propositions don't have to be written down. Just waiting for it to stop saying my internet connection is unfit. Propositions don't have to be sentences. They're intelligible entities. You can just think them, and they're accessible to anyone who has a mind, and without getting into issues of that, timelessness and existing in a special realm and whatever it happens to be. But propositions are intelligible entities which express truths which can be put into language. The correspondence theory, very broadly, is simply the idea that what is it that makes our propositions true? Well, it's that they correspond to something extramental. They correspond to real being, which we say is the truth maker of that particular truth, and its various modes of expression or possible modes of expression. So the correspondence is basically the proposition corresponds to how things really are, you might say. And that, of course, is exactly what it says and this is a very standard thing in our tradition. So the truth of a proposition is it's corresponding to nafs al-amr. Question then becomes, well, what is nafs al-amr? As we saw last time, in a common sense view, let's say in fiqh, they say, if he's really telling the truth in nafs al-amr about his deen, then great. In that case, nafs al-amr, he's not thinking about metaphysical theories, nor should he waste his time on such things because he's busy doing fiqh. If he starts getting worried about what nafs al-amr is at that point, then he's not going to get very far with his legal career. So, and it's the same with Ibn Kathir. Although that's a more advanced, metaphysically advanced level of discourse, because he's talking about, what is really God's law. The faqih or the mufti or the mujtahid, they say what they think God's law is, but it might not really be God's law. They might be wrong, according to certain views. There are some who might say otherwise. But in any case, so that is broadly a correspondence theory. I mean, a coherence theory, which we'll see with Kant, and really comes in with Kant, according to Norman Kemp-Smith, is the idea that there's a paradox involved in the idea that propositions have to correspond to anything outside of themselves, because that kind of there can't really be anything outside of our representation. So you're trying to say there's this realm which hypothetically isn't inside our representation, and then our representation has to correspond to it somehow, and that doesn't make sense. So they come up with, according to them, they come up with this coherence theory, which is when you look at the disparate elements of cognition and you find that they are all fitting together coherently, then you say that the thing is true. So in Kant's case, that's when you get the concept of the categories and concepts of the understanding, the categories of the understanding, which are the concepts, and they cohere with the intuitions, which is the the forms of time and space, which are the forms of sensibility. And you have all of those things sitting there together, exactly as Kant would like. And then it's true because that's just, those are the components of the apparatuses of human cognition, which actually have objects, because he would say reason doesn't have a real, the pure use of reason, which is the way that traditional metaphysicians used reason, doesn't actually have an object. So you need an intuition, which gives you an empirical aspect, and then it gives the form to the matter of sensibility, which is sensation. So time and space is the form of sensibility, which renders pure sensation intelligible, but they're all imposed upon the object. And then the categories render things intelligible relationally. We'll go into Kant in some detail, and I hope for anyone who's not familiar with Kant, that will be, ticking the Kant box. Because if you have Kant just, looming there in the background your entire life, you don't know quite what he's up to, it's problematic. And also he's so influential, and one finds that really Kant is the way that modern people think. And that's how, you'll find that everywhere, but he's the one who's really going for it theoretically and trying to show. So he says, no, coherentism, there's no correspondence. There's just the coherence of the apparatuses of our cognition. Then on the level of identity, you'd say, no, the proposition is in some real sense the intelligible representation for what, it's not the cognition, is the same as the object. But that doesn't mean we're in idealism here. It might mean, for example, that the agent intellect is providing intelligibility to both of them, and so they are in some sense the same. Or an identity theory, and other identity theories can be that we, as knowing subjects, as we become purified in the path of knowledge, we become identical to the objects of our knowledge because of our shared derivation of our being from metaphysical principles. There's all sorts of different ways of looking at it.
Sorry, Sheikh,
you can hold it up so you don't have to crouch.
Sorry, Sheikh, you mentioned deflationary theory as well, which I believe is one of the more prominent theories of truth these days. Could you just quickly explain what that is, if that's possible? If not, you could relegate it to another time.
No. I can, but it's so ridiculous that you won't believe it. So the deflationary theory of truth is also called the no truth theory. And this is one of Quine's brilliant ideas, which is that the truth of a proposition is identical to its assertion. Why? Why not? Why not? It fits into naturalism and the whole world being neural impulses and us just being these accidental mutations much better, because the problem of truth is a very serious problem for the naturalist. I mean, it's an insoluble problem. It's just it's crying out to them about the existence of a metaphysical realm. And so, the deflationary theory or the no truth theory basically means that the truth of a proposition is identical to its assertion. And there are sophistical complexities there, of course. But thank you for that. So, so the tension becomes particularly acute when we consider the possible subjectivist implication of positing that the mind is the original locus of these intelligible objects and truths. Well, if it's the original locus, then obviously the subjectivist implications are very strong. This is al-fard. The fard is that these are purely mental. So if you want to stay within that fard, then there's a subjectivist implication. We will meet with formulations of and solutions to this and related problems by Fakhruddin al-Razi, is very important in this. Ibn Baha'uddin, Toshko Prezad is very important. Ismail Galambawi has beautiful things on this and others. On the ontological level, we're faced with the problem of the positive identification of Nafs al-Amr. Is it an actual level or degree of being the world of truth and reality, a world in and of itself. Why? Because we don't find all of the elements of intelligibility in the extramental particular, they're just not there. And we can't say that they're just the mind, because then we'd have the implication of subjectivism. And also we wouldn't be able to distinguish between true and false mental propositions. If they're true by being mental, then true and false propositions are equally mental. You've appeared, Sidi Mustafa. Is that because you wanted to say something, or did your elbow accidentally turn on the camera?
No, I've been online for all this time, Ustad. The video's been on. I don't know, maybe sometimes Zoom puts some people at the
Oh, right. No,
front.
just appeared. Ahlan wa sahlan. Lovely to see you.
Shukran. I've been here all this time. Thank you. Walaikum.
Alhamdulillah. Is it an actual level or degree of being, a world in and of itself? If this world doesn't contain what would be necessary for a realm of truth and reality, and the mind can't provide that, then perhaps when we say, when we utter truths, this is because we are participating thereby, or making contact with, or having ittisal with, there's a kind of conjunction that we have with a world of truth and real being that then becomes filtered down into this changing world of flux and matter and huzn. So yes, so Tashkar Brazada synthesized aspects of Avicennan and Akbarian thought, and so on. So we'll see that all coming, inshallah. So can we go? There can be little doubt. And then we get to the notes, Sidi. I'll read the notes, because there's about 4 notes in a row I wanted to read.
There can be little doubt that we live today in a world in which traditional metaphysics, as the universal science that critically specifies the general principles of all other sciences and guarantees their coherence and objectivity, has been almost entirely relegated to the status of historical curiosity, if not forgotten altogether.
Okay, let's do 24 here. 34. For an agreeably thorough contemporary account of the Aristotelian roots of the concept of a universal science, see T.H. Irwin, Aristotle's First Principles. For the even deeper Platonic roots, see Hans Joachim Kramer, Plato and the Foundations of Metaphysics, a work on the theory of the principles and unwritten doctrines of Plato with a collection of the fundamental documents, 77 to 91, and especially 83 to 89. See also our exposition of the ontological foundations of the transcendentals with Platonic, Akbarian, humble correctives in chapter 4. For Avicenna's own exposition of his conception of universal science, upon which late Islamic conceptions are largely based, very, very important to our tradition. You'll see largely mirrored in the beginnings of Sharh al-Ma'arif and Sharh al-Maqasid. وَلَوْ كَرِهَ الْمُتَكَلِّمُونَ الْجُدُدُ. See Avicenna's Al-Shifa, Al-Ilahiyat 1, Jordan Nawasi and everything. For 2 important later kalam expositions, although you can use Marmora's good translation, parallel English-Arabic. Well, it's parallel English-Arabic anyway, it's fairly serviceable, astaghfirullah. For 2 important later kalam expositions that identify many of the attributes of the concept of universal science with kalam, see Taftisani Sharh al-Maqasid, volume 1, 5 to 15. That's the old edition in this bibliography, and Sharh al-Ma'arif 32 to 61, and also Tahanwi Kashaf under Al-Ilm al-Ilahi. Sorry, Maulana. Oh, no, you got up to this. Then number 35. So this is important for us because the notion that universal sciences critically specifies the general principles of all the other sciences, and this is something that Maulana Dr. Karim, who wrote The Anatomy of Knowledge, hugely inspired us with when we began this project, this notion of the subordination and subalternation of the sciences, tartib al-ulum. I mean, this project is called tartib al-ulum. And I'm very glad to say that now everyone's talking about it, so that's absolutely wonderful. And that's exactly what we want. So 35. So this has been forgotten. 34. For an agreeably thorough contemporary account of the Aristotelian roots of the concept. No, not that one. Oh, no, sorry, this isn't the one I thought. If it be objected that metaphysics as a branch of modern philosophy is alive and well, it should be emphasized that the operational reality of modern academic metaphysics is so marred by its having adopted, quite without justification, a universal and dogmatically unresolvable skepticism as to the nature and validity of first principles that is unable to make any real progress, nor indeed even approach being adequate to the role detailed above of traditional metaphysics. Now, this again comes back to one of the things that Sidgwick Site talks about in his paper, which is psychological disposition. And this is something you see very strongly. You know, one of the lies of modernity is that it's very objective and dispassionate, which is, pretty much the exact opposite of what it really is. I mean, it's really the most anti-reason in any substantive sense. I mean, the anti-intellectual movement in history, and yet it manages to rhetorically present itself as paragon of the standard bearers of rationality and reason. But modern metaphysics is a disastrous case because it deliberately will never get anywhere. You see, it deliberately will never get anywhere. As soon as sees you trying to get somewhere and actually reach a conclusion, a substantive metaphysics, they say, no, there's skepticism. There are people who have said that this is uncertain. There are people who have said this is uncertain. So it would be very unsophisticated of you to build any, because there are people who have, this great academic, he said, principle of non-contradiction is not even true. Of course, in saying that, he's using the principle of non-contradiction, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a methodological skepticism, which you find almost everywhere. And then there are some thinkers who just break through that and they tell people how it is, and then they fall victim to the kind of relativist postmodern framework, which is that, yes, these are all different points of view and they should all be respected, but ultimately, it's just his culture, or it's just his proclivity, or it's just whatever it happens to be. So that's that now. Could we go on, Siddy, from the consequence of the consequent absence?
The consequent absence of universally acknowledged first principles required to assure the fundamental intelligibility and indeed objectivity of debate in matters philosophical is, although this is really explicitly acknowledged, certainly very sorely felt by those aspiring to have philosophy taken seriously as science once more.
So prominent exceptions in the relatively recent Islamic intellectual world, in which this absence of first principles is less pronounced, include Shaykh al-Islam Mustafa Sabri in his Mawqif al-Aql wal-Ilm wal-Alam min Rabb al-Alamin wa Ibadihi al-Mursaleen, and Ismail Haq Izmirli in his Yeni Ilmi Kalam. And the loss of first principles was also a key feature of the broadly neo-scholastic diagnosis of modern philosophical infirmity. See, for example, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, Reality, and Gilles Son, The Unity of Philosophical Experience, and then there's other stuff. Thank you, Sidi.
For the academic mainstream in the European Middle Ages and in the Islamic world for long after that period, broadly Avicennan metaphysics or first philosophy was supreme, indeed the most scientific of all sciences, its principles serving as the theoretical underpinnings for all of the other sciences.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. This was not taken to imply, not in the Islamic world nor in medieval Europe, that first philosophy was an essentially higher science than the sacred sciences of revelation. Rather, so this is really a question of directionality. Rather, the principles of first philosophy merely constitute the, albeit ontologically grounded, epistemological preconditions for any form of science. So this is just about, what we are as human beings, as knowing subjects when we encounter the revelation. It's not in any form of competition with the revelation, hasha. The object of an epistemologically subordinate science, however, may be immeasurably superior to that of the epistemologically highest science. The science of Quranic exegesis, for example, studies the divinely revealed scripture, which is a manifestation of one of the attributes, divine speech of God. However, procedurally, exegesis presupposes the foundations and assumptions laid by kalam with its metaphysical underpinnings. For a discussion that briefly touches on some of these points and shows how Quranic exegesis and kalam can both claim to be, from different perspectives, the highest science, see Al-Alusi's own introduction to his Ruh al-Ma'ani, volume 1, 25.
This predominance continued in the West until the decline of scholasticism and the rise of the corpuscularian natural philosophy in the 17th century. And in the Islamic world before the destruction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries of the traditional curricula in the great learning centers of learning, such as Al-Azhar in Egypt, Farangi Mahal in India, and the madrasas of Ottoman Turkey and Iraq.
Yes. The signing into law by the Committee of Union and Progress, so these are the gang who succeeded Abdul Hamid al-Thani, radiallahu anhu, of the Ottoman reform of the Madrasas Bill in 1914, put the survival of the traditional Islamic sciences in great danger. Students were now to study Western natural sciences and sociology, and the traditional subjects were vastly truncated. See Ahmet Bain, Ottoman Ulamat, Turkish Republic, Agents of Change and Guardians of Tradition. The reforms were not to last long, however, before an event took place even more disastrous for the survival of the traditional curriculum, the dissolution of the Ottoman state itself, 1922. A similar decline occurred in post-Mughal India, especially with the disintegration of Farangi Mahal. See Francis Robertson, the Ulamat of Farangi Mahal in Islamic culture in South Asia. And the rise of Deobandism, a phenomenon whose scholastic reforms were largely opposed by the traditional scholars of India. For example, explaining the remarkable intellectual power and openness that the traditional aqliyat curriculum provided students, one of the last of these prominent traditional scholars, Abdul Bari Farangi Mahal, said, he's saying it, not me, said, would you rather have it that students became like sheep, like the alumni of Deoband, or people whose knowledge is superficial, like those from the Nadwa since Shibli's death, or those who belong to the Ahl al-Hadith in Delhi? At Al-Azhar, as elsewhere, the intellectual sciences, aqliyat, were certainly the most sharply affected by the almost universal waning of the Islamic sciences throughout the Sunni world at the beginning of the 20th century. The 1911 reforms of the Azhari curriculum signaled the end of study of advanced philosophical works of metaphysical kalam like Satadi and Tafsir al-Maqasid, and their replacement by far more basic books like Jawharat al-Tawheed, Al-Kharida, and al-Barahin. And then there's various references. Now, just a moment, because okay, let's just read this last paragraph. I want to finish on time today, haram, because people, yani, we shouldn't keep people. So if we just read the rest of that, Sidi, and just up to here, that would be great. Thanks.
Basic insight that makes the concept of nafs al-amr so critical, and that most of the developed theories of nafs al-amr we will be considering sharing, is that although truth claims of whatever kind are doubtless mind dependent in terms of their mental formulation and subsistence, their truth or otherwise is something that cannot be accounted for by the mind in isolation. This is because the mind is not the ultimate source of the abstract and universal concepts and first principles that inform each instance of human knowing. Likewise, the mind possesses no faculty whereby it can self-verify the modes of cognition in which it is naturally equipped, without intuiting its true ontological status as the limiting locus of truths which emanate from an experimental, intelligible domain. The human mind imprisoned within itself must give in to subjectivity. It is only by discerning the congruity or discordance of the mental phenomena responsible for the formulation of these truth claims, which manifestly experimental. Of these truth claims. Of these truth claims with manifestly experimental phenomena, that this implication of subjectivism can be avoided, and it is then that the question of the scope of the experimental arises.
Thank you, Siddiq. And then this point notwithstanding, it is also important in order to bring the question of nafs al-amr into sharper relief that is distinguished from another form of truth justification. The question of the ontological justification of the sciences, nafs al-amr, here broadly speaking, a correspondence theory, is distinct from that of the internal justification of the sciences in modern parlance, i.e. the foundationalist theory. 39. See if there's something. So when it says, and it is then that the question of the scope of the extramental arises, note 39, that is whether it is limited to the world of extramental particulars, or contrarily, that it is not limited to extramental particulars, but encompasses a vast domain of distinct intelligible realities that is prior to extramental particulars, and of which the world of extramental particulars constitutes a mere restricting particularization. So we've got 25 minutes for our discussion. Maulana Niyaz. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
I can. Let me pin you.
Okay. Okay.
I wish we had like a big screen or something too. Maybe I'll bring one next time. I really to use a. Sorry, Maulana. Let me just organize this. Oh, there's Muhammad Sami. Tafadhal, Siddiq.
Yeah. First of all, I'm definitely not a Maulana, so.
Don't say that.
It would be better to say Mol Anna. But anyway.
We're all Maulanas here, Habib. That's what I love about this. It can be anything you want to be.
But anyway, my question had to do, you said something I think I found a little bit interesting in terms of the idea that, I think you said it a little earlier, about the fact that in academic circles, the Quine's idea and this kind of empiricist framework, this positive framework, has basically been discredited and outmoded. And so, I mean, I couldn't, from what very little I'm familiar with, in the discussions in circles of philosophy of mathematics, yeah. I have heard that is the case, that realism is basically still a kind of a is more prominent than the other schools that might adhere to this type of a framework. But I don't know, frankly, that of this being outmoded in the other fields of the natural sciences. Yeah. I'm just curious about any, I don't know, titles or authors or, who have very forcefully kind of discredited and outmoded, so to speak, this empiricist framework in some of the other, let's say, we'll call them for now the modern natural sciences.
Absolutely, Maulana. Thank you. The thing is, this is a very particular thing I'm talking about. So this is not empiricism in any broad sense, it's verificationism.
Okay.
And this is a position that was put forward by a member of the Vienna Circle, A.J. Ayer, who was, for Youngs, was the professor of a prominent professor of philosophy at Oxford University. And he was one of the most prominent, along with Carnap and others, and then later you have Quine, who kind of gives a pragmatist version, adherent or representatives of logical positivism. And the verification theory was simply the notion that, which he put forward in, I think, his book, Truth, Language and Logic, when he was, I think he wrote when he was 25 years old, A.J. Ayer. He put forward this theory that was very influential and just sounded wonderful to people at the time, which was that for a proposition to be meaningful and true, it has to have an empirical referent. And so what we need to do, we need to have a program, according to this view, where we take the propositions of the sciences, of philosophy, of whatever it happens to be, of ethics, and we have to somehow ground them in an empirical particular, in what is ultimately a sense impression. And so, of course, in the natural sciences, there are all sorts of statements, as you know, which do not have, clearly, they do not straightforwardly have empirical reference. There's no sensation involved in a lot of the theoretical apparatuses of, let's say, modern physics. And so, they had this program, which in some sense or other insisted that there has to be, and so there were ways of kind of mediating that, well, yes, it when you look at it, it doesn't seem to refer to an empirical particular, but in this way or other, it's reducible to an empirical particular. That's what it really is. And so this was a very popular theory in the 30s and 40s, the kind of heyday of logical positivism, and people like Carnap and A.J. Ayer, and the Vienna Circle, of course, are very well known. And this is one of those examples in philosophical history where a theory is actually categorically proved to be false. And everyone agrees it, even the person who came up with the theory, which was A.J. Ayer, and he had to come up with a kind of weaker version of the verification theory. But how did they disprove it? Because this is quite an interesting. Does anyone know? Does anyone present know? Sidi Mustafa Aziz? Yeah, I thought you did. Go on.
I mean, I don't know if I do it, but like just a try. I guess one of the things was that some of its principles themselves don't stand the test, that they don't meet the criterion that it stipulates that all meaningful assertions have to meet.
Thank you very much. And Hamza Hashmi also said it in the note. The verification theory can't be verified. So the verification theory itself, where's the empirical referent? Huh? Come on, give me an empirical referent for your verification principle. Bueno. Yalla, give me the empirical referent for the verification principle itself. And that is really how it happened. And it's something you can look up in philosophical history.
See, just one interesting thing about A.J. Ayer, which is, as a philosopher, he was discredited at Oxford and many other places, definitely around the 1940s.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is outside of the philosophy department, he was very influential, for example, in the philosophy of law. And influential in the thinkers that actually dominated the philosophy of law. People like Hart and others at Oxford. So he had a nefarious influence way beyond the philosophical school.
Oh, is he?
In the social sciences, for example, and elsewhere.
Wow. Mm-hmm. I remember
where things are not questioned philosophically, but are postulated philosophically. And that's an interesting way of how this kind of poison spreads.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, he explicitly, I've seen, there's a very interesting series of videos that were kind of made in the 1970s about philosophy. And they used to make interesting television programs back then with some serious content, but they had him and Bernard Williams. I think, and he explicitly says foundations in metaphysics are completely arbitrary. You just have to make a choice about where you're going to start and just go from there. I remember you talk about A.J. Ayer a little bit in your Being Good. So, alaykum bihi. It's a wonderful little book, Being Good. Is your hand still up, Mustafa Aziz?
Very sorry. No, I should have lowered it. My apologies.
Oh, sorry. So anyway, you know, these views, because of the psychological, the kind of governing psychological dispositions of the age, these, what are basically verificationist views, are still going absolutely strong. You just get more khabith and, frankly, khabith and sophisticated versions of them. So, you know, Quine was trained directly by the Vienna Circle, and he was the golden boy, essentially. And but he knew that he couldn't keep on putting forward something so primitive. So, I mean, if you want a grotesque, I'm sorry, but there's no other way to say it, a grotesque vision of the world and of philosophy, look no further than the philosophy of Quine. It doesn't get worse than that. I really don't think it gets worse than that. You know, behaviorism plus pragmatism and plus methodological skepticism and just pure sophistry. That's what you get with Quine. And he's probably the most influential, or one of the most influential philosophers of the last 50 years. But he essentially perpetuate and scientism, plus a bit of scientism, throw in a bit of scientism. So, you know, he tries to create a full, and naturalism, of course, a full naturalistic picture of the way that, you know, not knowledge works, which is basically in line with the Vienna school, but it's less straightforward than that kind of simple verification as empiricism. The way that he achieves that is basically by turning it into a pragmatist doctrine at base, which is broadly the notion that we're not really saying that anything is true. We're just talking about the practical use that it has within building a certain theory because of the fa'idah that brings to the construction of our system, the way that, you know, our best scientific theories are, you know, whatever that's supposed to be. Everyone nods wisely when we say our best scientific theories. So, what? What best scientific theories? They all presuppose metaphysical assumptions, which they could either be true or false, and they have to be evaluated on the appropriate metaphysical level. But someone like Quine wants to subordinate metaphysics, or what, you know, would have great difficulty calling it metaphysics, but he would probably reluctantly call it metaphysics eventually, to our best scientific theories, so that science essentially becomes the handmaiden of philosophy. Essentially becomes the handmaiden of empirical science. Yeah, W.V. Quine, note 8 of the introduction, developed the philosophy of the Vienna Circle into his own nominalist, deflationist, behaviorist, and scienticist anti-system, and who celebrated what he viewed as one of the main achievements of empiricism after 1800, namely, quote, naturalism, abandonment of the goal of a first philosophy prior to natural science. Is there someone who has their hand up?
No, just a small thing about, like, since you were mentioning Quine, I just, from my experience, and I was forced to read him for a course as well, a little bit of his thought. I also, from our last discussion, I was reminded of Dr. Kareem's point about psychological disposition, I think one element that's really key in the psychological disposition of Quine is something that he's inheriting from a kind of much older historical legacy, maybe, which is this idea that it's been around since Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Hume, and certainly Kant himself, the idea that traditional metaphysics, the metaphysics of essence, the view that our cognitive structures stand in a deep community with their objects, that we catch reality as it is, intellectual intuition, etc. The metaphysics that is in this kind of orientation is essentially an endless history of disputes. So conflict and dispute, and nobody can agree with anybody. That's what Carnap also felt. So there's this very patent sense in this Anglo-American, but also in some sense French, Descartes are part of it, tradition, that traditional metaphysics is just senseless, mindless disagreement. And we get sobriety with kind of empiricism. So I think that's also, I think that's one of the psychological or maybe historical presuppositions of most of their work. That's just a thought that came to my mind. They think that traditional metaphysicians are just idiotically just, talking about things that can't be answered or something.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Thank you so much. Sidi Mustafa Aziz and his wonderful brother Taimur, I think maybe the first Muslim siblings to ever both study philosophy at Harvard. Go on, Maulana. Sidi Ahmad, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, actually I do. Just turn the video here.
How wonderful.
So
having in Cambridge.
Since I'm Quine bashing, I thought I would join. I happen to study with somebody who studied with Quine. Today, analytic philosophy is defined by its naturalism. How did it get that way? Well, really, Quine is central to this major twist in the history of analytic philosophy, where naturalism becomes acceptable along with a kind of pragmatism, as Sidi Hasan was mentioning. But I think it's very important to realize that basically naturalism has won in what's called analytic philosophy in the analytic tradition, and that has a lot to do with Quine. On the other hand, Quine, for many very hardcore logician type philosophers, so like some people that I've worked with, Quine is thought of as a little bit of a not taken very seriously. And so there is a sort of a regiment in analytic philosophy that are more like logicist oriented, and they don't take Quine very seriously. And their attacks against Quine are quite devastating. So there are some great internal critiques of Quine's work and of what Quine stands for. But at the end of the day, he's actually won out in the tradition. As to this sort of eschewing metaphysics, this has a long history, but it really takes off in a new form, actually, in a new radicalized form at the beginning of the 20th century with the rise of analytic philosophy, where basically one of their fundamental premises in their tradition, like in what they describe as who they are, is actually anti-metaphysical. And this is not just a psychological or historical position, it's actually a result of a new kind of a logic that emerges. It's called polyadic logics, with what we today call classic logic, but which are not really classic at all. And this was used to basically just slap around the metaphysics that these early analytic philosophers, strawmanned, really. And this is a deep tradition against anti-system, anti-world building, anti-metaphysics.
Thank you so much, Maulana. That's very, very kind of you. Sidi Umar has written on, I believe you have a book on Bertrand Russell and analytic tradition, and I highly recommend that. It's very wonderful to have you with us, and very much looking forward to benefiting from you further. Inshallah, we will go into some, in the historical section, some of the foundations of, well, at least one very, very major antecedent of the subsequent deterioration of philosophy, ala wa huwa Immanuel Kant, and that will be in some detail. There's also a second paper coming out on specifically on Kant, which I'm hoping will get through the censors by then, which would be absolutely wonderful, in which case we can try to read it. Well, at least it can be read in parallel to us actually going through that part in this book. But yes, I mean, you know, I really want these sessions to be a way for us all to benefit. I've got so much to benefit from all of you. And I'm hoping to be able to ask various of you to present. Sidi Sakshi has very kindly agreed to present on the 31st of January, but to really get to grips. I mean, this book, I spent 7 years on it. I don't want to self-eulogize, but it was a kind of labor of love. I at least loved writing it. Most of it was written in my living room in Amman. And you know, this project with Sidi Karim has been such a eye-opening and illuminating and stimulating thing to be involved with. But this is just the beginning. And, you know, one of the ideas behind bringing you all together is that the hope that as our project goes into its next stages, we can enlist your help for peer review, for exploring these issues more carefully, very specific aspects in more depth. And so that, you know, it's my hope, I mean, many of you already are writing, but it's my sincere hope that every single person here will themselves contribute to the process of, I don't want to say tajdeed because it's very presumptuous, but will do their own part of khidmah in undertaking to treat, you know, very, very specific issues, foundational issues, which continue to be problems for people. We have to get beyond the level of general discourse. We have to go to the level of foundational discourse and not have to look to other people, whether it's the Thomists or the Platonists or whoever it happens to be, or writers writing hundreds of years ago in the Western traditions for answers to these very, very specific foundational questions. I mean, we've dealt with the problem of objective truth. We've dealt with, in the modern sense of objective, we've dealt with the problem of first principles, of the problem of the representation of knowledge in definitions. How can essences and natures be graspable in terms of our relational language and so on? But there are so many other questions, and I'm just really hoping that we can work together in order to try to achieve that aim of having something which is not necessarily a comprehensive library, of metaphysical library, but something that's grasping towards something close to that. And you know, I need many, many more years to be able to do something like that. And I think we're all in it for the long haul. I mean, someone like Sidi Niaz I met in 2007, and I don't want to praise you, Sidi Niaz, forgive me, but Niaz made the commitment, I'm going to study for the next 40 years, and like, that's it, no one's going to stop me. Nothing's going to go my way. And he left everything and dedicated his life to that path. And that's what we need to be. We need to be students from the cradle to the grave. It's not about, you know, it's a sad thing, but it's not what we want. It's not that, you know, I went and studied for, you know, in Syria. I did my time, you know, now come and treat me like the big sheikh. Now I'm going to tell you what our mashayikh, you know, told us, that you have to have good adab. And it's like, oh, you're mashayikh, and they're not learning anything. And this person's not learning anything. and he's just telling people basic commonplaces about the ulum, which, a good beneficial knowledge, but what seems to be more important than real knowledge is just the enactment of this kind of hierarchy of, I'm the alim and I'm the sheikh, and you're the humble laymen who are trying to improve your religious knowledge. You live out your lives in the worldly bad modern world, and we need discourse which is empowering. We need people who will commit to years and years and years and years. We need learning from the cradle to the grave, and we need to really nail certain issues. It's not about making ourselves feel better. It's not about being able to go to bed feeling that our iman is safe, and we don't really have to think about that worrying thing anymore because someone gave me a half-an-hour lecture where he cried and beat his chest, and now I feel better about everything. And don't look at that kafir philosophy. It's all we have everything in our tradition, and don't worry. We need serious answers. The problem that we face today is not so much a problem with the so-called awam, it's actually a problem with the khawas. You can't go to, and it's not their fault necessarily, it's because our knowledge structures have encountered a world that they didn't know about before, they don't fully understand. And so often the response can be reaction, that's what you sometimes find, that we save ourselves from that danger by creating a bubble of piety, where we don't really look at that too carefully. We adhere to the outward prescriptions of our deen, and of course that's very important. And we have to work out whatever solution is feasible given our circumstances. But none of those kind of band-aids, none of those tawadeh type solutions can ever be ultimate solutions and really fully adequate solutions, which, I don't want to be trite and say for the next generation, but even for us, we might be stuck here for another 30, 40 years. Do we really want the discourse to remain on that level, where, we don't have, we gain our kind of sharaf by intisab to Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard and things. We don't have our own traditional high-level institutions in place where, a lot of our so-called Islamic universities are really third-rate secular universities with Islamic studies on a kind of worksheet. They're not even reading. We're talking about nafs al-amad here. What is our real tradition? Who are real ulama? We're also faced with the fact that as many of people I feel very, very certain and are acknowledged as great awliya, I'd be very lucky to meet many of them. Sadly, very little rubbed off, as you can tell. But the awliya and the great masters do not want to appear in this time. They're going into hiding. They can't. The situation is becoming so extreme that I can't account for their decisions or what leads them to that. And it's of course the divine guidance. But what we know is that very few of them. They need to have a special vocation now in order to be able to appear, and it's very difficult for them because there is so much confusion, there is so much willful misunderstanding, there's so much. We're going through ahwal of eschatological phenomena. So, and that's true. It's also true about the intellectual tradition. That's why one must be not suspicious or anything like that. And we always maintain adab. But when you see something that's waving the flag of everything's absolutely fine. Look at our wonderful ulama, and look at our councils and our conferences and our things, and everything's being taken care of, and you've got the silsila, you've got the tradition, you've got the transmission, it's all in place, nothing's wrong, it's all absolutely fine. And just come to us and we'll give you everything, and you'll have you should be a little bit nervous about that, because we are in an analogous situation to the poor man who got hit on the head very hard and then woke up and couldn't remember what happened, and then he starts piecing together everything, and that's very much the situation of the Muslim world. We took a terrible blow and we don't really remember what happened and what's been lost. And I think isolation to some degree, not isolation, but uzla to some degree, knuckling down and not necessarily worrying about fitting into whatever current happens to be available now, but looking, for the longer term is perhaps something that, inshallah ta'ala, by God's grace, will yield beautiful results. That's what they tell me in any case. Maulana, Man, would you mind including with a prayer which will bring some barakah to the cold environs of this city.
الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد اللهم اغفر لنا كل الذنوب واستر لنا كل العيوب وتب علينا يا مولانا نتوب اللهم بقدرتك على كل شيء اغفر لنا كل شيء ولا تحاسبنا على شيء ولا تحجبنا عنك بشيء اللهم يا خالق كل شيء بقدرتك على كل شيء لا تحجبنا عنك بشيء واكشف عنا هذه الحجب التي حجبنا بها أنفسنا عنك يا أرحم الراحمين ويا أكرم الأكرمين واغفر لنا هذه الذنوب التي حجبتنا عنك يا أرحم الراحمين سبحانك قد أكرمتنا وتفضلت علينا وأسأنا إلى أنفسنا فيما بيننا وبينك فتولنا بفضلك وجودك ومنك وكرمك وإحسانك ووفقنا إلى ما تحب وترضى والطف بنا فيما يجري به القضاء واغفر لأمة سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وتجاوز عن أمة سيدنا محمد واجعلنا هداة مهديين على نهج سيد المرسلين اللهم إنا نسألك من الخير كل عاجل وعاجل ما علمنا منه وما لم نعلم ونعوذ بك من الشر كله آجله وعاجله ما علمنا منه وما لم نعلم اللهم نسألك من خير ما سألك منه عبدك ونبيك سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وصحبه وسلم وعبادك الصالحون ونعوذ بك مما استعاذ به عبدك ونبيك سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعبادك الصالحون وأنت المستعان وعليك التكن ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلي وسلم وبارك على حبيبك سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم الحمد لله رب العالمين باستئثار الفاتحة
جزاك الله خيرا everyone. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.